Hi, friends. Happy New Year, and welcome to the very first episode of Sane for 2023. We're really happy to have you. So for those of us who know and have joined us before, this is the Institute for Christian Apologetic Studies, and a few months ago, we started a new virtual program called Sanepo. Sanepo is a Twi word that translates Unknot, and it's two-pronged in its approach. We have Nia Jesusumo and Nubledede. And we've had previous episodes up on our YouTube channel. And so if this is your first time, you're very welcome to look up the previous episodes, and we hope that it's a blessing to you. Once again, Happy New Year and welcome to today's episode. Today, we'll be talking about sexuality and gender. And we are very excited today because we have a special guest joining us to take us through the subject. I'm happy to introduce Stefan Gustafsson, who is the Director for Apologia at the Center for Christian Apologetics, and also the Founding Secretary for the Swedish Evangelical Alliance. Hi, Stefan. You are very welcome. We're really happy to have you here.
Very good to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation.
You're welcome again. Can you please tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yes, I can do that. I'm sitting in the center of Stockholm, and we have this organization Apologia, Center for Christian Apologetics. So I am an apologist. I'm a trained theologian, and I worked most of my life with evangelism, a lot of student evangelism here in Sweden and in Europe, with a specific focus on apologetics, a recent presentation of the gospel of the Christian faith.
Amazing.
I'm married to Ingrid. We have 3 grown-up children, and a number of grandchildren are coming along now. So that's very exciting.
That's really exciting. Thank you for sharing all that with us. So we'll just want to move straight into the presentation. So I'll turn it over to you to talk to us about sexuality. So please.
Thank you so much. I've chosen to formulate the subject this way. Let's talk about sex, and then to focus on a very specific question and issue that is very much a burning issue in my culture and in so much of the Western world, and it's gradually becoming a very divisive issue, actually, in many places of the world. So my theme for this morning is LGBTQ, the traditional wisdom questioned. And of course, I come to you from the country that maybe is leading the world in the direction of the sexual revolution, and turning so many of the traditional values just upside down. So maybe for some of you, what I will be talking about is it can seem a bit strange and maybe not that absolute relevant in your context, but I think we need to be realistic. What is happening in Sweden and in the Western world, it looks like there is a direction here that will be affecting most of the globe. So I think it's important for every Christian to think through different issues of sexuality, and not least this issue of LGBTQ. It's a huge issue, and there are many different perspectives from which we can address the issue. We can have a philosophical and ethical perspective on sexuality and on same-sex relations. We can come from it from a biblical, theological perspective. And of course, we can come from it from a very personal perspective. All issues of sexuality is affecting us personally and can be very deep questions. It can be very painful questions. It can affect us as individuals, or it affects a specific issue can affect someone in our family or close friends. And we need to be really sensitive and compassionate when we talk about sexuality. And when I'm studying church history, for example, I'm really saddened by the way the church so often have addressed issues of sexuality. There has been so much hypocrisy, so much harshness, so much condemnation. And I think we need to really think through the way in which we discuss issues of sexuality. And if some of you who are listening to this have been hurt by the church, I'm really sorry, and there is a need to apologize for a lot of Christian voices that have maybe wanted to reflect truth, but have done it without reflecting love and grace. And of course, in the gospel, you cannot separate truth and grace. They goes together. And I hope we can have a dialogue today that reflects both truth and grace. Now, culturally, the Western world has gone through a most dramatic change. Even during I don't consider myself very old, during my short lifetime, my culture in Sweden has been turned just upside down when it comes to how we are thinking about sex. If we focus in on the view on homosexuality and homosexual relationships, I have experienced just during my few decades of life 4 very different perspectives in Sweden. So when I was a child and I was growing up, most people, even in Sweden, were looking at homosexuality as a kind of disorder, as something that has gone wrong, and ideally it shouldn't be expressed or lived out. It was one of many disorders within us human beings. So it was a mainly negative view. That gradually merged into a thinking of, okay, we just have to realize some people are same-sex attracted, and it's not their fault. They have no real choice, and it's too harsh to say you should abstain from your a sexual life. So maybe we need to say, well, it's still not the ideal, but for some people, it's kind of an emergency solution. There is no other way. So we have to accept that some people form homosexual relationships. That in turn gave way for a third view, where people say, no, we cannot have a negative view saying it would have been better if they lived another way. We need to look at same-sex relationships, homosexual relationships, as an equivalent variation. You know, we human beings, we are different. We have different skin color and color of our eyes, and different length, and different hair colors. And it's just a variety. It's basically just a positive variety that makes life more interesting, that we are not the same. So you couldn't evaluate saying it's one side is better than the other. And that in turn has, for some people and in some contexts, moved into the view that homosexuality is a superior lifestyle, lifestyle. Gays have more fun. People who have chosen that to express their identity, they have gone against the majority. So they are really authentic and they are more creative. They have a bigger courage and so on. That is not the majority view, but you can hear it from some people. The majority view now in Sweden and in most Western countries is the third perspective, that it's an equivalent variation. So it, of course, should be affirmed totally in the same way you affirm a male-female relationship. Now, this is a huge change in just a few decades, where the view has been just turned upside down. And I would argue that there are very few that drastic cultural revolutions that has taken place in such a short time and just changed not only the legal settings, but the attitudes of the population. Now, why did it happen? Why did it happen? Is it possible to understand this sudden change of views in our culture? Well, in one sense, it's not sudden because it follows from the sexual revolution, which is a long-term change in Western cultures, going back to the Enlightenment. And gradually, for 200 years, a new view on the human being and our place in the cosmos has replaced the Christian faith in the West. So gradually, people have started to reject God and therefore reject absolute morality. There is no design, no plan, no meaning, no identity to human beings. We are autonomous. We need to create ourselves. And that has gradually changed the view on sexuality and on marriage. And as a last part of that huge change, it has started to affect the view on homosexuality. So it's a natural child of the sexual revelation. More concrete, the change during the last decades where we have changed view on homosexuality, that change has been argued mainly by a number of cliches. That can sound like a very harsh statement, but I think it's actually true. It's argued by kind of rhetorical strategy where you have some very smart formulation that sounds like a good argument, but actually is not a good argument. Let me show you what I mean. So one of the basic arguments has been, well, everyone has a human dignity and everyone has a human right. So you cannot say that homosexuality is wrong because then you deny that person's dignity and value. Now, of course, human dignity is very, very important, but the fact that we all have equal value, equal dignity, does not mean that all actions are right. You need to distinguish between a person's dignity and value, which needs to be affirmed, and as a Christian, I strongly affirm that, but you need to distinguish that from the question, which actions are right sexually and which actions are wrong. A valuable person can actually perform a morally wrong sexual act. Others have referred to science and said, well, today we know there is a gay gene, it's genetically caused, our sexuality, and it's unchangeable, and therefore we need to just affirm its right to live it out. Now, here's two problems with that argument. The first problem is that genetics do not decide ethics. An action can be right or wrong regardless of the genetics of the person who perform it. So that's two different questions. What kind of genetics do we have? How much does our genes influence us? And what actions are right? Genetics does not solve the problems of ethics. The second problem is that scientifically, it's a false statement. Today we know quite sure that there is no gay gene. And if you want to look into this, you can study this quite recent article, 2019, from Science. How do genes affect same-sex behavior? Where they study identical twins with who have identical setup in terms of genes. And it's very clearly shown that there is it is not our genes that causes our sexual identity. Others have said and referred to nature and said, well, it's found in nature. So animals, you can see a kind of homosexual pattern amongst animals, and therefore it's natural. So we cannot say anything if humans are showing the same pattern. That is a strange argument. Animals have never been our moral role models. That would be a horrible way to argue, because amongst animals, anything can happen. They kill each other. They eat each other. So animals are not our role models. It's irrelevant for our ethical discussion what's going on in the animal kingdom. And fourth cliche, love can never be wrong. Well, this is in one sense not a cliche. I 100% affirm it. Love can never be wrong. Love, that means to show compassion, to show goodness, to care about another human being. That can never be wrong. I totally agree. But we need to distinguish between love and sex. I'm called to love my parents. I shouldn't have sex with them. I'm called to love my friends and my children and my brothers and so on, but I'm not called to have sex with them. So love is never wrong, but sex can be wrong. So the discussion we need to have is, in what loving relationships is it right to express that love sexually? That is the relevant issue. And lastly, I've met some Christians who have said, I've prayed about it and I have peace. Now, it's very important that we as Christians, we bring our lives before God and we pray about it and we search for God's guidance. But as a Christian, we cannot only be guided by our inner sense of peace. We need also to relate the issues to the Word of God. And sometimes our inner feeling needs to be challenged by the teaching of the Word of God. So it's not enough. It's a good thing to pray about it, but that in itself cannot solve every question for the Christian. Within those cliches, what is the typical thing here is a lack of distinctions. So a number of issues is put into like it was just one issue about love or about human dignity or about feeling inner peace, when there are other dimensions to the issue. Here's another example of this. In the Swedish Wikipedia, you have the word homophobia. How is that defined? It's defined like this. Homophobia encompasses a range of negative attitudes towards homosexuality, LGBTQ culture, or people who are identified or perceived as LGBTQ. And this is a very dangerous definition because it puts together three separate issues. What is my view towards homosexuality? That's one issue. What is my view against LGBTQ culture? That's another issue. And what is my view towards people with a certain sexuality or that are members of a certain culture? Now, I want to answer those three questions separately. It must be possible, for example, to affirm white people at the same time as you criticize some aspects of cultures that white people are part of. Or opposite, other colors. We need to distinguish between the person and the culture they are part of. Of course, I want to show love towards a person, regardless of their sexuality, but I can still have I can still evaluate a certain sexual way of living. So this is just an example where they have put together three separate issues and labeled them all homophobia. Another aspect of what's going on in the Western world is how this is an area where a totally incoherent argumentation is accepted. Very often in Western culture, people are proud of being rational and reasonable and logic and so on. That's buzzwords that people think are very important. But in all issues related to LGBTQ, all those words are gone. So if we just look at the different letters here, the arguments around the lesbian and gay homosexuality, it's very often this is a fixed identity caused by genes and biology. It cannot be changed, and therefore it should be accepted. But the B, bisexuality, suddenly you have a very flexible identity where you can move between hetero and homo, and you can choose. So now it's not fixed any longer. And then you have T. Now it's fixed again, but not the body. Now it's the inner being that is fixed. And the inner soul, the inner identity, the person is in conflict with the body. So now the body is going to be changed. And then Q, the queer perspective, saying, no, there's no fixed identity on any level. Everything is constructed and everything can be deconstructed. There is no authenticity. There is no intrinsic identity within us that we should be true to. The only thing we should worry about is forming an ego, that is, to quote the French philosopher Foucault, who is one of the prophets of the sexual revolution, the ego that is a work of art. You can construct and deconstruct yourself in any way you want. So here is not a coherent perspective on what is a human being, how to view the body, how to view our inner beings as persons. So there is no coherence, there is no logic in how people reason within those questions. There is not an anthropology that hangs together, a view of the human being and of sexuality that hangs together any longer. Okay, this is my way of trying to describe what has happened in my country and in the Western world. Now, if we move from just analysis of what has happened culturally, we move to the next question. How should one think about sexuality? How do we reason in relationship to sexual ethic? Now, interestingly, even though much of the sexual revolution have said, since there is no God, we are free to create our own lives, nearly all people realizes, well, the freedom cannot be 100%. There are some lines that needs to be drawn. Not all sexual acts can be affirmed. So there is nearly no one who says there are no sexual boundaries at all. We can think, for example, pedophilia, adults having sex with small children. Very few people would accept that. So people draw a line. Even people who reject God and affirm the sexual revolution, they draw a line somewhere. So here is the key question. How can we draw a line? Is it right to buy sex from a prostitute? Is pedophilia right? Is homosexuality right? Where do we draw the line? When I listen to Western culture, there are a number of criteria people have suggested. So they would say, well, basically the criteria is follow your heart. Don't go against your own inner heart. Do what you want as long as it is a real expression of who you are. Well, I think we should listen to our hearts. We should listen to ourselves, but that is not enough. And most people realize that, and they say, well, follow your heart as long as you do not hurt anybody. So you are not free to hurt anyone. You cannot have sex if it means that you rape another person. So follow your heart, but as long as you do not hurt anybody. And then people say, yeah, that's true, but we need to underline it needs to be among consenting adults. So don't relate yourself sexually to children. It needs to be adults, grown-ups. And you need to be sure about consent. And the whole Me Too movement have underlined that so many people have thought that they are following their heart, they are not hurting anybody, but they have not really been sure if there is consent. And so many women all over the Western world are now raising their voice and said, actually, I was not consenting to that. I was hurt by what happened. So I do agree with this, with these criteria, but I still don't think they are enough. So what is missing? Well, I would say there is no connection to love. And I think that's strange when you think about sexuality and you do not talk about love. Because everyone knows that in real loving relationships, sex play a very important role. There is a connection between sex and love. When sex is at its best, there is the dimension of love between the two persons. So I think it's such a cultural weakness that we discuss sex without relating it to love, to commitment. And secondly, there is no connection to the body. Biology is missing, including procreation, even though biologically, evolutionary, if you want to bring Darwin and that theory into the picture, procreation is the main aspect of sexuality. And it's very strange to discuss sex without discussing also biology and our body. There is it's a very, very small percentage, but there are some people who are sexually attracted to trees. If you study psychology, you would learn about that. Recently, or a few years ago, there was an interview with a young Swedish woman who said, her sexuality is directed towards trees. So she goes out in the forest to search for sexual encounters, to connect with trees and be sexually aroused by trees. And she brings home some branches and so on. Most of us would say, here is really something lacking for this woman. It seems like she is not true to the full reality of what sex is meant to be. The fullness of sexuality, including for her to carry a child in her womb and to be the mother of a new life, it's not absent. It is absent when she relates herself to a tree. And the personal encounter and sharing and connection, which is meant to be there between her and a man, is lacking when she's relating herself to an impersonal object as a piece of wood. So I would say she is not experiencing the fullness of what sex could be, or in my view, is meant to be. So I would argue, firstly, that we need to bring back what is in Western history is called natural law. That is that you try to look what something is intended for, what is the full potential of something. So here is, you see on the picture, an acorn. And the intention of that acorn, the full potential of that acorn, is to become into this majestic oak tree. That is you can say, the meaning of the acorn. And in the same way, I think there is a place to discuss what are the indications within us for what we are designed for as human beings. And it seems like we are not designed to relate to an impersonal object like a tree, because there we cannot experience the fullness of what our bodies and our persons are designed for. Like if the acorn is not put into the ground, the full potential of what it is will not be a reality. It will never become an oak tree. So when I look at us as human beings, I would say hetero and homo are not identical. And I think that is that's just a fact of reality. Homo and hetero are not identical. There are differences. And I say that not specifically out from the Bible, for example. We are soon moving into the Bible, but this is just a looking at reality, that physically, bodily, a man's and a woman's body belong together sexually. The sexual organs fit together between a man and a woman in a way that two men and two women and their sexual organs do not fit together in that natural way. So physically, there is an indication that it is a man and a woman that belongs together sexually. Biologically, sexuality and reproduction is connected. The only way for new human beings to come into being is through the sexual union of one man and one woman. And this is not a small thing. For humanity, that is the whole future hangs on that fact. So biologically, a homosexual relation is sterile in this area. Of course, not in other areas, but in this area, it's a sterile relationship. It cannot reproduce new human beings. And psychologically, homosexual relationships lack the complementarity between male and female, which is a complementarity that we value in so many other areas, in politics, in the workplace, in boards and so on. We very often say, well, it becomes richer if there is both male and female, because there is a complementarity we bring to the table. So I think that just from reflecting over reality, there are some indications that points to the heterosexual relationship between a male and a female. Now, I'm of course a Christian, and I do not only look at God's creation, I also look at God's word. And as a Christian, my view on life is of course taken from the Bible. In the discussion today, when in the Western world more and more churches are changing their theology and start to just echo what the culture says, so too many churches in the West are now affirming same-sex relationships and are performing same-sex marriages. And they say we are not doing that against the Bible, because there is a new and better interpretation of the biblical texts. So let's move into that. If one wants to study the Bible and think about sexuality and same-sex relationships, there is basically 5 groups of biblical texts that address same-sex relationships. The first groups of text is the 2 creation narratives, the 2 texts about creation in Genesis 1 and 2, where we have God's meaning with human beings and with our sexuality. And there the perspective is 100% heterosexual. God creates male and female, and he calls them to multiply, to procreate, to be God's co-creator in bringing human beings into life. And in chapter 2, God first creates a man, and then out of him creates the woman, and the 2 of them are then called to come together sexually to form a new unit and to be one flesh. So the starting point is the male-female relationship. It's procreation, and it's the bodily unity between a man and a woman. Secondly, the second text is from Romans. So now we move to the New Testament, and Romans chapter 1, where Paul has a long section where he goes through God's wrath over sin. And Paul places us, everyone, regardless of our sexuality and our sexual history, under the wrath of God. We are all sinners. We have all lost the glory from God. And there is a certain passage where he also talks about same-sex relationships, both lesbian and gay relationships. And it is viewed as against God's will from creation. And then there are 2 sin catalogs, 1 Corinthians 6 and 1 Timothy 1, which also mentions men who have sex with other men. And that is in list with a lot of other sins, also other sexual sins. Then we have 2 places in the Mosaic covenant in Leviticus, chapter 18 and 20, where same-sex relationships are condemned. And we have 2 stories, 2 horrible stories about God's judgment in Genesis 19 and Judges 19, where also same-sex is mentioned along with many, many other sins, and it's under the wrath of God. In my view, it's important for us as Christians that we structure these texts in the right way. Too many Christian presentations go through the Bible here chronologically, but they do not start with creation, but they start with Genesis 19 and Sodom and Gomorrah, and then moves to the Mosaic law in Leviticus, and then moves into the New Testament. I think it's important that we structure it the way I've done it here, that we start with creation, which is the natural starting point, and that we then move to the New Testament, which of course have such a crucial place for us as Christians. So we need to look at what Paul is saying in his letters to us as Christians. And then, of course, we also need to look at the Mosaic covenant, but we need to realize that the Mosaic covenant was given to the Jewish people. It was belonged to the old area that looked forward to the Messiah. And we as Christians, we don't use the Mosaic covenant just as a handbook that we can flip open and we read a verse and say, well, that is how we should do today. Because of the new covenant, Leviticus now has a different place. I'm not saying it's irrelevant, but we shouldn't take our starting point there. And the same with stories. We cannot build our theology based on stories because there are so many aspects involved in stories. So we need to, I think, look at in this chronology. When we do that, of course, we can see that all 5 groups of texts point in the same direction. They have the same perspective, that same-sex relationships are not within the will of God. It's not in God's intention, his design. It was not meant in creation. And after the fall, it is looked upon as one of many aspects of the fall, something that has gone wrong for us as human beings. Now, many churches have tried to give a new interpretation specifically of Paul. They're saying, well, Paul is not rejecting faithful, loving same-sex relations. He's rejecting what he's looking in his his contemporary culture, where same-sex relationships were connected with idolatry, with promiscuity, or with abuse. And what he's actually saying no to is idolatry and promiscuity and abuse, not the same sex as such. And some have argued that Paul didn't even know about loving, committed same-sex relationships. Now, I think this new interpretation of Paul fails. It clearly fails. It do not do justice either to Paul's letter themselves or to what we know about the culture. Just briefly, of course, we should have a whole presentations on Romans 1, but just a few observations about this key text in the New Testament on same-sex relationships. The overall logic of what Paul is doing in that huge section is to show how we as human beings, all of us, has inverted, put upside down reality. We are worshiping creation instead of the creation. We are looking for the mortal instead of the immortal. Because of the fall and our rebellion, we have turned everything upside down. That is Paul's main argument. And he places all of us under the same judgment. We are rightfully under the wrath of God because we have made this rebellion. The section that speaks specifically about lesbian and gay sexual relationships has a certain function. It comes first in Paul's description of specific sins, not because it's a worse sin than any other, but because it is so illustrative of his main argument that we turn things upside down, inside out. We reverse what God has designed. And that is so visible in that sin. But the same principle is there in all of our sins. When he describes the homosexual relationships, he's not describing that people are worshiping other gods or that it is abuse or pedophilia, but he actually describes that people have a sexual desire for each other. There is a mutuality involved. So the argument that this is an abusive relationship that Paul rejects is totally false in relationship to the text itself. The whole section is marked by a number of references to the creation, to Genesis 1, where God created us as males and females. So he talks about since the creation of the world, he talks about serving created things rather than the creator. He talks about images of birds and animals and reptiles, which is a quotation from Genesis 1. He talks about exchanging natural for unnatural. He talks about image. So it is like Paul is sitting with Genesis 1 open when he is describing how we have deviated, all of us, from what was God's intention from beginning. And finally, the man who's writing this is Paul, and he was a Jewish scribe. And we know that the Jews at this time had a uniform rejection of homosexuality. And of course, Christians were following the Jewish Messiah, and he had a very strict sexual ethics. We also know that Jews in antiquity, they rejected same-sex relationship. Josephus, who writes approximately the same time as the Apostle John, or slightly after that, he has clear passages about this. The Jewish philosopher Philo, who is writing just earlier of Paul, he has the same attitude. Both of them says that Jewish people reject same-sex relationships based on the creation story, God's intention from the beginning, and the covenant, Leviticus. It's also false to say or assume that Paul didn't know anything about faithful, loving homosexual relationships. Actually, long before Paul, people in the Greek culture were well aware of not only promiscuous homosexual relationships, but also faithful. So in Plato's dialogues, the Symposium, there are discussions about sexuality, and one of the persons in the dialogue, Aristophanes, talks about two men who want to be joined together and want to live together. So what we now see in the Western culture may be on a broader scale than in antiquity, but it was not unknown in antiquity. So it's wrong to assume that Paul didn't have any knowledge of that kind of same-sex relationships. So the result for me is that I both from just reflection of a reality, natural law, and from my study of scripture says that I do not affirm same-sex relationships. Now, this is, of course, very, very difficult to communicate in the Western world today. And as I said, I work as an evangelist and an apologist. And wherever I go on a university to present the Christian faith, to present the gospel, to talk about science of faith or the reliability of the gospel, or why do I believe God raised Jesus from the dead, or whatever the subject is, I can be absolutely sure that someone will raise their hand and say, well, what's your view of homosexuality? That is, of course, a little bit frustrating to have to respond to that question, regardless of what the subject of my lecture is. Well, sometimes I can say, that's a very important question. We all know that sexuality is important, but we also know that if we start to discuss that now, all the Q&A time will be focusing on that question. So the two of us, we can talk about it afterwards. Now I want to have questions about the reliability of the Gospels, if that has been the subject. Well, sometimes that works. Sometimes people will not accept that, but they demand that I should say something about what's your view of homosexuality. Then my response would be like this. Well, if you want to know my view, I cannot give you just a simple yes or no. So if you want to know my view, you need to give me a few minutes in order to explain my thinking. And if they give me permission to that, I would say this. Well, my perspective is this. Every one of us are created in the image of God. Therefore, we have dignity. We are made in the image of God, and we are loved, regardless of who we are, regardless of our sexual interests, regardless of our sexual history, what we have done or people have done to us. We are loved by God, and we are invited by Him to become His children. So I affirm strongly the dignity of every human being. Secondly, as a Christian, I think of all of us as broken and fallen. We are sinful human beings. That's the theological term, the biblical term. And the Bible places me at the bottom, which means I cannot look down at anyone else. If I do that, I have not understand my own Christian faith. We sit in the same boat, on the same level. We are sinners. We are broken. Our individual problems can differ, but basically, we sit together at the bottom. I cannot look down on anyone. So there's no place for me as a Christian of contempt for another human being. Of course, I can evaluate, and we can evaluate certain acts, but looking at the being of a human being, I shouldn't feel contempt. We are both created in the image of God. We are both fallen and broken and in desperate need of God's grace and forgiveness. Thirdly, I'm a strong proponent of a free society. You have the freedom to choose what you believe and how you're going to live your life. And that includes how you want to live your life sexually. I want to choose what to believe and how to live my life, and I want to give you the same freedom. Of course, we need some kind of limits. We are not allowed to hurt each other. We need to have some basic limits. But within those limits, you are free to live the life you want. Fourthly, you have understood I am a Christian, so I believe there is a creator God. And therefore, naturally, my question is not, what do I want? Now, that is an important question. I also ask that, what do I want? It has its place. But above that question is, what is the will of God? What is God's will for my life and for my sexuality? And I think you can understand that follows logically. If there is a creator God, his will is, by necessity, above my will, because he's the creator. Of course, if you don't believe in God, you will not ask that question. I understand that. Then the only question you will ask is, what do I want? But if there is a God, the whole picture changes. Now, in the Western world, you know that Christians do not agree on the view of homosexuality any longer. We are divided, and you can find the different churches here in Sweden, for example. Why are we divided? For 2,000 years, we were united in our view. Now we are divided. There are two reasons for that. One reason is that we do not any longer are prioritizing body and soul the same way. So when there is a discrepancy between the signals of our body and our own inner attraction, what should we go with? It's obvious that our bodies by themselves are signaling a heterosexual signal, because a male sexual organ fits with a woman's. The biological purpose of sexuality is procreation. It can only happen in relationship to a woman. So there is a kind of priority just bodily for male-female relationship. On the other hand, a person can experience deeply the attraction to the same sex. So then what should you go with? The traditional Christian position is you should follow the signals of the body. And the reinterpretation is no, you should affirm your the feelings of your inner being. So we are divided. And secondly, there's a division in how to interpret the Bible. One group is saying the Bible is saying no to same-sex relationships on a principle level. Other people says no, those verses are misunderstood. They just deny abuse and pedophilia, certain homosexual acts within a certain context, not homosexual acts as such. So we are divided. It's not a secret which camp I do belong to. I think we should take seriously the signals of our body, and I think the Bible clearly teaches that God's intention is the male-female relationship. The position I take, and which is the historic Christian position, is of course very difficult to understand in modern individualistic Western culture. I understand that totally. But you need to see that we have a different hierarchy of values than the culture at large. All cultures have a list of values, and you place some of those values at the top. Now, our culture places today sexual expression at the top. To live a fulfillment, rich human life, you need to be able to express yourself sexually. Now, as a Christian, I have a high view of sexuality. It's an important aspect of being a human being. But as a Christian, I do not place that at the top of who I am, of my identity, and what can lead to a fulfilled human life. And that, of course, I can do because I follow a celibate man. You need to understand that we as Christians think that Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus Christ, lived the most beautiful, the most fulfilled, the most meaningful life ever lived, and he never expressed himself sexually. So that would be a way for me to answer in front of a secular audience. Then maybe someone will follow up and say, okay, I'm a lesbian. What's in it for me? Or I'm a gay man. What's in it for me? Your Christian faith. What's in it for me? That's a very natural response. That's a very natural response. I totally get that that question needs to be asked, because the Christian faith here contradicts one of the highest values in our culture, that is individualism and expressing oneself sexually as an individual. We think that self-expression, especially in the area of sexuality, is the road to happiness. That is the key value in our culture. The Christian answer is that you have the right to choose yourself, but not all choices are right. And what I'm here to do is not to ask you to change your sexual lifestyle. I'm here to invite you to investigate the Christian faith. So the first step is, of course, not to change your sexual lifestyle. The important thing is to discover if the Christian faith is true or not. if you find that it is true, then of course things start to change. Still, you can ask, what's in it for me if I choose to deny myself and obey God? Well, according to the Christian faith, and if the Christian faith is true, it means that by doing that, you will come into sync with your Creator. You will come into sync with reality and what you are created for. You will come in sync with your true identity, which is that you are made in the image of God and you are here in order to glorify Him and to show love to people. But even more, you are, if the Christian faith is true, invited to be a child of God and experience His love, which is richer and more glorious and wonderful than any love you can experience from another human being. You might know that Jesus claims to be the bread of life and to be the living water that can fulfill our deepest hunger and thirst in a way a sexual encounter cannot do. And that He can fulfill our deepest longings and needs, not only in this life, but forever. So there is actually a wonderful richness in it for you and for me if we bow ourselves before God. Okay, that was a long presentation. I'm sorry taking up so much time. I should come to an end here and say this is kind of overview, a cultural analysis of what's happening in the Western world and an argumentation for the traditional wisdom and for the biblical view on same-sex relationships.
This was a very, very insightful presentation. Thank you for giving us so much to reflect on. Thank you so much. And to our friends, thank you for sticking with us through this presentation. We hope that you take the time to watch this and watch it again, because there's just so much to glean from this and to reflect on with what's going on in our culture as it pertains to sexuality. So we're going to go on a short break, and when we come back, we will transition into a dialogue. Thank you.